Good afternoon. My name is Michelle Lane. I am the Senior Director for Community Wellness and Corporate Health here at North Kansas City Hospital, and I am so grateful that you are joining me today. I am going to be talking about the science of sleep, and this is a topic I am so passionate about. If you've ever heard me, there's a couple things that I just absolutely love, and sleep is one of them. So we are going to dive right in and we are going to talk about sleep. So, sleep, interestingly, is, one of those things that it's like you think that you're not doing anything, right? Nobody thinks anything's really happening when you're sleeping, but, there is so much that happens. I used to think that sleep was just something I had to tolerate, to be honest with you. My alarm clock would go off and I would just be so annoyed. Um, but you don't eat, you don't drink, right? And so therefore it's a total waste of time, but it's not. It's really a superpower. And we spend so much of our life sleeping. The average person, they will spend 36% of their life sleeping. If you live to be 90 years old, then 32 years of your life is going to be spent sleeping. And for most of us, sleep really isn't even a second thought, right? And so it's really incredibly important to understand that sleep directly affects our relationships. It directly affects our life expectancy, our libido, weight gain, cardiovascular health, and our immune system. So, science is really understanding the value of sleep, and we really want to leverage this superpower. So, my goal today is to help you understand a little bit more about sleep and change the views and ideas and thoughts you have about sleep so you can stop or start doing something to help improve your sleep cycle. So let's talk about the brain just real quick. If sleep is a superpower, then the brain is definitely a Swiss Army knife. The brain only weighs about 3 pounds, 75% of it is water. And that means just a 2% decrease, a 2% decrease can have a negative effect on your brain function. We actually have a medical term for brain dehydration. It's called brain fog. Another really fascinating fact about the brain is we have two brains. So in utero, as our brain develops, part of that tissue stays back and it forms our gut. And it's tied to the manufacturing of our neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, those feel-good hormones are made in our gut that was originally part of our brain. So in utero, the brain splits off. Part of it goes up to that skull to form the brain, and part of that brain tissue stays back and makes our gut. So our gut health is so important. And the brain is amazing and complex. So scientists have found that sleep actually could be this elegant design solution to some of the brain's most basic needs. So all of the organs need two things. They need a continuous supply of nutrients to fuel the cells. And in the brain, this is especially critical because it's intensely electrical up there. So it uses a quarter of our energy supply. It only takes up about 2% of our body's mass, but it takes up 25% of our energy. And our cardiovascular system solves the nutrient delivery problem by sending blood vessels to this every corner, the nook and cranny of every part of the brain. And so just as every cell needs nutrients, every cell also has a byproduct. And so the clearance of that waste is the second basic problem that all organs must solve in the body. And all the organs use, well, all except the brain, use this really cool system called the lymphatic system. It's a second parallel network of vessels that extends through the body. It takes up proteins and other waste from between the cells and it collects them and it dumps them in the blood so we can have them be disposed of. But if you look closely at this diagram, you can see that one thing is that there is no lymphatic system in the head, right? And so how then does the brain solve this waste clearance problem? Well, the solution is really downright genius and it's kind of beautiful. So the brain has this large pool of clean, clear fluid called cerebral spinal fluid, CSF. CSF fills that space that surrounds the brain, and the waste from inside the brain makes its way out to the CSF, which gets dumped along with the waste into the blood. Sounds like the lymphatic system, right? But it's not, because what's interesting is that fluid and waste from inside the brain, it doesn't just like percolate out randomly in these pools. Instead, there's this specialized network of plumbing that organizes and facilitates this process. The CSF is pumped back and into the brain on the outside of the blood vessels. And if you think about that, using the outside of the blood vessels is like this clever design solution, right? Because the brain is enclosed in this hard, rigid skull. So there's no extra space for like a whole nother system, like the lymphatic system. So yet the blood vessels extend down to every part of the brain. And so what they've done is on the outside of the blood vessels, that's where the cerebral spinal fluid runs. And no other organ takes quite this approach to clearing away its waste between its cells. And this solution is just absolutely entirely unique to the brain. But the most surprising thing that I thought is this brainwashing, right? The cerebral spinal fluid brainwashing only takes place in a sleeping brain. So you have to sleep in order to get that brainwashing. Now, there are 4 sleep stages. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, but I think it's important to understand. Stage 1, super light sleep makes up about 2% of your sleep time, and it's that transition between awake and sleep. And it's when your muscles start to relax, your breathing starts to slow, and your brain kind of slows down a little bit, and your eyes may roll kind of back and forth a little bit. And it takes about 5 to 10 minutes, and this is the first stage. The second stage is really also at the very beginning, and you might feel like you're kind of falling if you've ever had that feeling. It's called it's like a wake up when it's called a sleep start, I think is what it's actually called. But this is when you were woke up right as you were falling to sleep. And remember that the body's core temperature needs to decrease 1 to 2 degrees when you're falling to sleep, and it typically takes place during this stage 2 of the sleep cycle. And then the third stage of the sleep cycle is your deep or your delta sleep. And so this is your physically restorative sleep. The when you wake up and you feel so good, right? And you're like, oh, I feel so good. Well, what happens during this deep delta sleep is kind of like you taking your car to the fix-it shop and they buff out like all those dents and scrapes from like the trash can being dragged across the side of it from your 21-year-old son who couldn't stand to the other side. Yes, that happened. But sleep in the deep or delta cycle of sleep is like buffing out all those scratches that you have on your car, but it's in your brain, buffing out all those scratches. And so, um, stage 3 is your deep or your delta sleep. Stage 4 is your rapid eye movement sleep. And this is where mental restoration takes place. So your eyes move very rapidly during this stage. You can actually see a baby or a puppy that's not closing their eyes all the way. And they have very active eyes. And during this stage, the body actually freezes during this stage. So you don't act your dreams out. You're essentially paralyzed. There's sleep paralysis, is what it's called. But in stage 4, you have your rapid eye movement sleep, and this is your mental restoration. And then additionally, it turns out that there's 2 specific systems that drive your sleep cycle, right? So your sleep drive is like your hunger drive. You get hungry and hungry and hungry, or you eat something, it dissipates. You're not hungry anymore, right? Well, the same thing holds true for sleep. When a cell eats a piece of glucose or something, it comes out the back end, right? There's a waste product. Well, that waste product is called adenosine. And so that chemical works itself through the brain. And as adenosine accumulates throughout the day, you get sleepier and sleepier. And so I'm going to kind of geek out here for a minute, but the molecular structure of adenosine is only one molecule off of caffeine. So that's why it fits perfectly into that receptor site in the brain. And when you drink coffee, it keeps you awake because it's blocking that adenosine receptor. So the sleep drive comes from the buildup of adenosine in your body. That's when you want to sleep, that need to sleep. And then the second the system in your body is a circadian rhythm. So just like you're hungry during typically breakfast, lunch, and dinner, there's a circadian rhythm that goes with eating. There's a circadian rhythm that goes with sleep. Actually, as a matter of fact, there's about 300 circadian rhythms in the body. And we want a balance between that drive and that sleep cycle. So one benefit of sleep we've talked about is the literal brainwashing. So I'm going to discuss the benefits and I'm going to talk about some consequences for sleep deprivation. And then I also want to give you some evidence-based strategies to help you improve your sleep today. So I think it's probably easiest to show the value of sleep by talking about what happens when we don't get sleep. So, shift work is an extraordinary example of this. So, 20% of the working population work on the night shift. And so, this body clock does not shift to the demands of night shift. It's locked into the same light dark cycle, the circadian rhythm that all of us have. And so, when people come home in the morning after working all night, their body is like, oh God, it's time to be awake. And so, they typically get a quality of sleep that's poorer than somebody who sleeps at night. But one of the things the brain does do is it indulges in these things called micro sleeps. This involuntary falling asleep that you have is, something you have essentially no control over. A micro sleep can be kind of embarrassing. I've seen people have micro sleeps in the middle of the meeting and you're like, oh geez. But they can also be really, really deadly. 31% of drivers reported feeling sleepy at the wheel just in this last year. And there was over 100,000 accidents on the freeway that were associated to some sort of falling asleep at the wheel, loss of vigilance, or just tired. So we've talked about that you need to get a good night's sleep before a test. And science says that whether you're cramming for an exam or you're trying to learn a new musical instrument or a sport, that there's actually a secret memory weapon that takes place while we're sleeping. So, memory and sleep are really valuable. Studies have shown that sleep is critical to memory for three different ways. First, we know that you sleep before learning to actually get your brain ready, almost like a dry sponge, ready to initially soak up all that good information. But without sleep, that memory circuits are kind of brain waterlogged as it is. And so you can't absorb new information. So we effectively don't lay down new memories. So sleep is important to be able to learn. But it's also important that you sleep before learning and after learning, because essentially sleeping is hitting the save button on those new memories so you don't forget. In fact, sleep will actually, future proof some of this information for you. So there's a couple brain structures that I want to talk about within this. So without sleep, the memory circuits of the brain effectively, just really can't function well whatsoever. But there's some mechanisms and file transfer processes that take place. And here we can speak about two different structures within the brain. The first is called the hippocampus, and the hippocampus sits on the left and the right side of the brain. And you can think about the hippocampus as your inbox of the brain. It's really good at receiving new memory files and holding on to them. The second structure is called the cortex. This is this wrinkly, massive tissue that sits on top of your brain. And during deep sleep, this is a file transfer mechanism. And so you think about the hippocampus as like a USB drive, and the cortex is your hard drive. And during the day, you're wandering around picking up all these files, right? And then during sleep at night, because of that limited storage capacity of our brain, we have to transfer those files from the hippocampus over to the hard drive in the brain, and that's the cortex. So that's another mechanism that deep sleep also provides. And then finally, sleep is beneficial for memory integration because it doesn't just simply strengthen individual memories, it's able to cleverly kind of interconnect them. And so as a consequence, some people wake up and have like this total great solution to a problem that was an impenetrable problem previously, and they have their best ideas in the shower. So there was a great study done by Matt Walker, who was a sleep scientist, who researched whether or not pulling an all-nighter was a good idea and beneficial. So they took a group of individuals who were assigned to this group that got to sleep for 8 hours, and then they got this group that couldn't sleep at all. So under full supervision in a lab, no naps, no caffeine, it was totally miserable. And the next day, the participants are put in these MRI scanners and they're told to learn a whole new list of new facts as they are in this MRI scanner, right? And so what they showed was after they were in the MRI scanner, they were tested to see, what their abilities were to remember things. And when they compared the two groups between whether you had sleep or not have sleep, there was a 40% deficit in the ability of the brain to make new memories without sleep, 40% less able to make new memories without sleep. Crazy. And then your sleep also affects your cardiovascular system. It takes place in just, there's an example is, there is a big scientific experiment. 1.6 billion people across the United States or across the 70 countries They have a test called daylight savings every single year, twice a year. In the spring, we lose 1 hour of sleep, and we see a subsequent 24% increase in heart attacks that following day. In the autumn, when we gain an hour of sleep, we see a 21% reduction in heart attacks. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. And we also see the same profile of behaviors within car crashes and suicides. When we lose an hour of sleep, there's more suicides, more car crashes. When we gain, there's less of these things. So there is a national campaign out there to help stop daylight savings time as something that we support because losing that hour of sleep is so detrimental. Sleep can also affect your reproductive systems. A little piece of trivia for you if you're ever on a game show. I found in my scientific research that men who sleep 5 hours a night have a significantly smaller testicles than those who sleep 7 hours. So if you ever need that information, you have it. But in addition, it does affect your reproductive organs. So men who routinely sleep just 4 hours to 5 hours a night have a level of testosterone of somebody 10 years older. And additionally, sleeplessness among female shift workers creates this excessive HPA activation, which results in early pregnancy loss and a failed embryo implantation. So you also see a decreased libido in women with less sleep. So I work in a hospital and we have young nurses, and typically the new nurses started on the night shift. And I can't tell you how many people I had trying to get pregnant who would talk to their doctor because they struggled, and their doctor would say, "Hey, come off the night shift," and they would get pregnant when they came off the night shift. So absolutely incredible. Another connection between sleep loss is weight gain. There was a 10-week study showing that if you just are in bed for 8 hours, you just make yourself stay in bed for 8 hours instead of the 6 or 7 that you had before, that you can actually lose weight. And this may be because you're not in your pantry eating Cheez-Its like me, but I think it's a great excuse to stay in bed longer. Our bodies have a way of communicating without us even knowing. First, your metabolism slows down and your cortisol increases when you don't get enough sleep. And so cortisol makes you have an increase in your appetite. And then secondly, there's also hormonal changes that take place when you're sleeping. We have hormones that tell our brain when we're hungry. So ghrelin is something that happens when we don't get sleep. That ghrelin shoots up in our body, and ghrelin is the hormone that tells us that we're hungry. And so an increase in ghrelin tells you, oh my God, I'm starving to death. And then we also have a hormone that tells us when we're full. And so that's called leptin. And we have a decrease in leptin when we don't get a good night's sleep. So I don't really think that my nightly ice cream is helping anything with my waistline, but I will tell you this. When I thought about how sleep is just not that important in relation to some of the other goals that I have in my life, like weight loss or weight maintenance, sleep may actually have a bigger effect than we thought. And so I think it's something to be mindful of. Our nightly slumber also affects our emotional centers in our brain. And so we need to think about sleep as first aid for our feelings, basically. There was another excellent study done at Oxford University where they took a group of healthy adults and they divided them into two groups, one full night's sleep, the other one sleep deprived. And the next day, put them in the MRI scanner again. And they looked at how the emotional brain was reacting based on if you got sleep or not sleep. So they focused on one structure in particular, and it's called the amygdala. And the amygdala is kind of like the overseer of strong emotional reactions, including negative emotional reactions. So people who had a full night's sleep had a nice, appropriate, moderate degree of reactivity from the amygdala. It wasn't as if there was no responses at all, but there was an appropriate response. Yet people who were sleep deprived, that deep emotional brain center was in fact super hyperactive, and the amygdala was almost 60% more responsive under conditions of lack of sleep. But why, right? So scientists discovered that there's another brain region that's involved in sleep, and this brain region is called the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex sits basically above your eyes. And you can think of the prefrontal cortex like the CEO of your brain. It's really good at making high level executive top down control decisions and reactions. And one part of that brain is that it controls that deep emotional center, the amygdala. So in people who had a full night's sleep, there was a nice strong communication between the prefrontal cortex regulating that deep emotional brain center and reaction. But those with a sleep deprivation, there was basically no communication whatsoever between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. And it was essentially severed. And as a consequence, the amygdala was responding far more reactively due to a lack of sleep. It was like an emotional accelerator. And so no break. And that seems to be why maybe we become absolutely unbuckled emotionally in terms of our emotional integrity when we haven't slept well. So taking a deeper dive, even more. I know this isn't, if that's not enough, right, to make you want to work on your sleep hygiene, but I also want to focus on your immune system. And here I'm going to talk about something called natural killer cells. And you can think of natural killer cells like a secret service agent in your immune system. They're really good at like identifying dangerous, unwanted elements and eliminating them. In fact, your natural killer cells can destroy a cancerous tumor. They're that strong. So what you want is this viral set of immune assassins in your body. But what happens tragically is when you don't get a good night's sleep, you do not have that. There was another experiment where people were sleep restricted to 4 hours for one night, and then they were evaluated to see if there was a reduction in their immune cell activity. Well, it wasn't just 10 or 20%. It was a 70% drop in your natural killer cell activity. That's a really concerning state of immune deficiency, and perhaps why there is a link between short sleep duration and cancer, especially cancer of the bowel, prostate, and breast. So, in fact, actually, there's such a correlation between lack of sleep and working the night shift that the World Health Organization has identified that any form of night shift work as a possible carcinogen because it is that disruptive to your sleep-wake rhythms. So, how do I know I'm getting enough sleep, right? Well, do you wake up rested? Do you wake up and need, an alarm clock, or do you do it naturally? Or are you grumpy? Do your coworker tell you you look tired or irritable? Do you struggle to get out of bed? Do you want to fall back asleep at 10 or 11? Or can you not function without any caffeine at all? Well, chances are you're sleep deprived. But the good news is that all of this is really reversible. With good sleep, we can lower our blood pressure, lower our heart disease, our immune function can come back, we can reduce the sexual dysfunction. All of that can happen with good sleep. So let's talk about some evidence-based practices. This stuff showed up in science. I need you to really change the framework in which you think about sleep. I need you to think about it as a performance activity, right? So I wouldn't go running in a pair of jeans and flip-flops, right? I wouldn't be as an efficient of a runner, but I would go put on dry fit shorts and Asics, right? And so these are things like putting on dry fit shorts and Asics to get you to sleep better. So number one is regularity. Go to bed, same time, wake up, same time, weekday, weekend. Regularity is key. It will anchor your sleep and improve the quality of your sleep across the board. It shows up in all research. Regularity, regularity, regularity. The second thing that is evidence-based is you need to keep it cool. Your body needs to have its core temperature about 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit to initiate sleep and to stay asleep. And the studies actually showed that 65 degrees is about the ideal sleep temperature. So the third thing we need to do is we need to make our bedroom a dark haven for sleep. Very important to reduce the amount of light exposure at least a half an hour before you go to bed. So light increases the level of alertness and it will delay sleep. It decreases the amount of production of melatonin in your brain. And melatonin is our sleep hormone, and it's very important. But it's so silly because the last thing we do before we go to bed is we stand in front of this massively lit bathroom, looking into a mirror, cleaning our teeth, and it's something we need to be mindful of. So I have a lamp in my bathroom now, and I turn on a little lamp when I brush my teeth. So blue light is also one of the things we need to be concerned about, 440 to about 490 nanometers. But what happens is when blue light hits our eyeball, it sends a message to our brain to turn off the melatonin faucet. Well, melatonin is what keeps us asleep. And so we want to make sure we're using filters or we're just not using our phones or iPads at all at night. And then additionally, evidence shows that exercise, even just 10 minutes of exercise a day, will help your sleep cycle. And then to remember to use your bed only for sleep or sex. You don't want to hang out in your bed. You don't want to, associate wakefulness with your bed. So another thing that I want to talk about is stimulants. This does affect our sleep. So caffeine represents the stimulant of choice for most of us. And if you're really naughty, you like nicotine. But some side effects of caffeine is kind of like two hidden features I think that a lot of people aren't aware of. And first, it's the duration. So caffeine for the average adult has the half-life of about 5 to 6 hours. And what that means is that after you drink caffeine in about 5 or 6 hours, the half-life is 50% of that caffeine will still be circulating in your system. So, in other words, if you take a drink of coffee at 2 p.m., there's about a quarter of that caffeine is still swirling around in your brain at midnight. And as a result, it may make it harder for you to stay asleep or sleep more soundly throughout the night. And then the second feature with caffeine is that it can also change the quality of your sleep. Some people will say that I can drink a cup of espresso with dinner. It doesn't, affect my sleep at all. I fall asleep fine. I stay asleep. And even if that's true, it turns out that caffeine can actually decrease the amount of deep, non-rapid eye movement sleep. So that's that stages 3 and 4 of sleep. That's the restorative deep sleep. So as a consequence, you wake up in the morning, but you don't feel refreshed. You don't feel restored by your sleep. You don't remember waking up. You remember going to sleep well, right? And you don't make this connection between that espresso at dinner and the fact that you don't wake up rested. So another stimulant is alcohol. So many people turn to alcohol. I've been known to have a drink or two, and that's okay. It will mildly sedate you and can be useful to help get you into that sleep transition. But alcohol does not provide sleep, it sedates you. And so it actually harms some of the neural processes that happen during memory consolidation and memory recall. And then the second problem with alcohol is that it can fragment your sleep. Alcohol can trigger that fight or flight response within the body's nervous system. Therefore, you wake up more frequently. People will report after heavy nights of drinking a fretful sleep. And so you want to make sure that you're careful with that and just be mindful with the amount of alcohol and stimulant intake in your body. So you might be thinking, so what if I can't sleep? What do I do? Well, don't stay in bed and lay there for more than 20 minutes. That's for darn sure. Get out of bed, go to a different room. You wouldn't sit at the dinner table all day and wait to get hungry, right? So it's the same thing. Go back to bed when you feel sleepy. There are some different exercises that you can do, controlled breathing exercises, earplugs, sound machines. I love this app called the Calm app. I have the free version of it, but it has meditation and mindfulness and these wonderful soft voices reading me stories. I like to try progressive muscle relaxation if I'm really struggling to get to sleep. So I gradually tighten different areas in my body and hold for 10 seconds as tight as I can, breathing in and out and slowly relaxing, and that causes my body to relax. You do always remember to turn your clocks away from you. It's okay to have an alarm clock in the room, but you just don't want it to, be able to look up and see that it's 2 a.m. because that will trigger you to have anxiety and maybe not go to sleep well. And then, there is other alternatives like aromatherapy. There was a lot of double-blind placebo studies, and it showed that lavender, vanilla, ylang ylang, and jasmine were able to help relax people. And then you also want to remember that, taking a nap during the day is okay. 20 minutes is fine. You want to set a timer. And the best time to take a nap is between 1 and 3 p.m. because we dip in our core temperature 1 to 2 degrees, typically between 1 and 3 p.m. We also do it around 10:30 p.m. too. So a nap is fine. 20 minutes is all you want. Set an alarm. And then I like to travel. And so I've developed this hack based on one of the neurologists told me. And so if you ever have a situation where you're only going to get about 4 hours of sleep, what you want to do is take about 6 ounces of black coffee, no sugar, no cream, no nothing to digest, and add a couple ice cubes to it so you just slam it. Drink it immediately and then lay down and set a timer for a 20-minute nap. Okay. And then remember how we talked about adenosine and caffeine only being about 1 molecule off? Well, that nap eats up the adenosine, and the caffeine will sneak in and block the rest of that adenosine. So you're going to be able to have that caffeine kick in and get energy. And it's just an absolute best hack I've ever found for when you can't get a good night's sleep. So let's talk a little bit about vitamin deficiency. So there's lots of reasons why you may not be getting a good night's sleep, and a vitamin deficiency may very well be one. So you can simply get some blood work done. For the probably easiest ones to get drawn is vitamin D, magnesium, iron, and melatonin. I would definitely start with those. And they're easy to solve too, with supplements. So get those labs drawn if you're having problems sleeping. And some of the other vitamins or supplements that showed up in the research is B3. So B3 lengthens the tryptophan, and increases the rapid eye movement sleep. And so tryptophan is the building block for melatonin. It's just a really important hormone for sleep. You can get B3 or tryptophan with whole grains, dairy, meat, broccoli, asparagus. And then B6 is also shown up in research, and it's required for serotonin production. So it can also help with your feel-good hormones too. But the body may crave high-fat foods because it wants serotonin. That's another trigger. And then vitamin D functions as a hormone, and it's produced in your body after sunlight, and also if you eat fatty fish or egg yolks. But you can take a supplement too to treat vitamin D if you want to. And then another over the counter that shows up in the research that can help sleep is magnesium. So it can boost the quality of your sleep. And so dark leafy grains or bananas. Banana water is one of the things one of the neurologists here told me about. He takes whole bananas, the skin, and he boils them, and then he strains off that banana and keeps that water in the fridge. And his kids will grab a cup of that magnesium or banana water, and it'll help them sleep a little bit. So, and then lastly, I want to talk about melatonin real quick. It's a natural hormone. It's excreted in our bodies, and it's not really great for insomnia, but it does work really good for jet lag or trying to bring that circadian rhythm back. Remember, it's not a sleeping pill. We've talked about that sleep drive and that sleep rhythm. It's not a regulator. It's not an initiator of sleep, but it can help you stay asleep. And so the correct dose is 1 milligram in order to reach that plasma concentration, according to an MIT study. And it takes about 90 minutes for it to work. So make sure you're taking your melatonin about 90 minutes before. But I also think that it's important to note that melatonin is not regulated by the FDA. And I did come across some studies that showed that when they pulled just melatonin off the counters by multiple manufacturers, they found that there was different milligrams than what was labeled on those bottles. And so you do kind of want to be careful with that. It does work well in a couple groups of people that I think are interesting according to science. And so melatonin works especially well with autistic or children on the spectrum, and then people over 50. And so that's because there's a natural drop in melatonin in autistic people or people over the age of 50. And so it can help replace that. And then lastly, an over-the-counter sleep aid that there is some research that seems pretty valid is valerian root. So valerian root is actually something you can take in order to reduce anxiety, but it does have a low tolerance for abuse. And so I think it's worth recommending. So valerian root does show to be pretty helpful. And then remember, of course, that if you have an injured tendon or something, you're going to go see an expert. You're going to go see an orthopedic. And so if you have a lack of sleep in your life, it could be your thyroid, it could be your B12, it could be menopause, low blood sugar, it could be arthritic pain, it could be heartburn, it could be sleep apnea. And I made a slide about sleep apnea because I read this great study in Neurological Today that showed that unaddressed sleep apnea can actually reduce your life by 7 years, which is crazy to me, especially with the science as advanced as we have with sleep and sleep studies. You don't have to go to a dark, freaky room and have a stranger stare at you while you sleep anymore. You get a kit, put this thing in your finger, you mail it in. It's so, so simple. And so I did attach some risk factors and some symptoms that are for sleep apnea, but one of the more interesting articles that I read was about the correlation between sleep apnea and heartburn. And so if you think about the body as a closed system, as you try to sleep, the body's going to try to pull air out of the lungs, right? But because of sleep apnea, it's occluded. And so it still is that positive pressure system. So it's going to try to pull that oxygen out of the lungs. But what's right next to it, the other pipe, is the esophagus. And so it's going to pull air out of the esophagus, which is going to go straight into the stomach cavity and pull those gastric juices up into that esophagus. And that's why a lot of people with sleep apnea have heartburn. There's a really high correlation. And so I thought that was pretty interesting to mention too. So I've given you a lot of information. You know, sleep is just not an optional lifestyle luxury. It is a non-negotiable necessity. Everybody needs to take their sleep seriously. You need to defend your sleep. I've said no thank you to some really good plans because it involved losing my sleep. We need good sleep to be able to have good concentration, decision making, creativity, cardiac health, our social skills, all of the things. So it is a superpower and I need everybody to use it. I am so grateful that you guys listen to what I know about sleep, and I'm going to share my email and my phone number. It's Michelle, Michelle.Lane, Lane, like fast lane, at nkch.org. And my phone number is 816-691-1692. And I would love any questions or talk to anybody about sleep. If you listen to this and you want to just chat, just give me a call. I'm happy to talk about sleep. So thank you so much for joining me, and I hope everybody has a great day. Thank you.